This is the 16th annual. We're really excited, and our theme is ecological and evolutionary perspectives on One Health. First, I wanted to start by acknowledging the Student Organizing Committee. This is a group of graduate students that spent a lot of hours organizing the EIS this year. They've selected the theme of One Health. They've organized yesterday's student talks, the oral presentations, the poster presentations. They handpicked and invited all of our plenary speakers today, and they've done such a great job. So for those graduate students who are part of that committee, would you please stand up so we can recognize you briefly? Next, I would like to thank this year's EIS sponsors. This includes 13 different Texas A&M colleges, departments, centers, and institutes. And the names of these are all featured on the EIS website. And it's through the support of these sponsors that we've been able to keep EIS as a free public event, and we're really thankful for that. In particular, one of our main sponsors is the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Interdisciplinary Program. This is a really exciting year for the EEB program. In fact, we're a degree granting program now, and this fall we'll start our first cohort of students that will be earning their PhD in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Texas A&M. So that's a great milestone, and everybody's really excited about it. Our theme today is ecological and evolutionary perspectives on One Health. And One Health certainly isn't a new approach, but it's increasing in its recognition, and it's become a popular slogan for interdisciplinary efforts within the health-related sciences. And more specifically, One Health provides a really nice framework for uniting efforts to try to improve the health of human populations, wild and domestic animal populations, and importantly, recognizing the shared environment in which we all interact. And so it's with that theme that we have a great lineup of speakers today. A common emphasis in any definition that you might come across of One Health is this focus on interdisciplinary collaborations. And so, for example, just drawing upon that, we might have a field biologist, like the one shown here, that's working on some problem. We've also got a veterinarian also working on a problem, a statistician or an epidemiologist, a molecular biologist, a human physician, and an evolutionary biologist. And they're all working within their own disciplines, in their own fields. They might have their own jargon, their own conferences, their own journals that they publish in. And working in isolation like that, they might miss the whole picture. It's only through building bridges and reaching out across forums that we can see the whole picture emerge. And of course, this is similar to the parable of the blind men each trying to work and figure out what an elephant is. And, working in their own disciplines again, they're only able to see part of the picture. It's incomplete. So this One Health approach, if anything, is really forcing us to reach out across disciplines and build bridges and communicate efficiently to try to improve human health, animal health, and ecosystem health. So with that, we're very thrilled for our lineup of plenary speakers today. So thank you all for carving the time out of your schedules to be here and accept our student invitation. Plunged into some field work for those of you who were here a couple nights ago, and we've been enjoying your interactions ever since. With that, our first speaker is going to be introduced by Andrew Golnar. Andrew is a PhD student in the Department of Entomology, and he's going to introduce Dr. Paul Gibbs. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hamer. So let's get this symposium started. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Paul Gibbs. Dr. Gibbs is a professor emeritus and former associate dean for students at the University of Florida College of Veterinary Medicine in Gainesville, Florida. Dr. Gibbs' professional focus is One World, One Health, by focusing on the control and prevention of emerging and foreign animal diseases, including those of zoonotic importance through research, education, and policy development. Dr. Gibbs is a well-known figure in the One Health community, and we have been looking forward to his presentation. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Great. And first of all, let me thank everyone for the kind invitation to speak to you today. And it's a great delight to be back here in Texas A&M. It was probably about 20 years ago that I first visited. And every time I visit, I see great improvement. And now I see we have all these collaborative programs emerging, and the spirit of One Health evidently is alive here in Texas A&M. And Sarah has already eloquently defined what One Health is, so I'm really just going to embroider that hat as we go through this morning. And in addition to looking at the ecological and evolutionary perspectives on One Health, I'll go and perhaps identify some of the future challenges that we all need to address. Well, where did One Health come from? Sarah has already mentioned to you that really One Health is not novel, but it is a new momentum. And that really has arrived as a new momentum, largely because of the fear that highly pathogenic avian influenza was going to impact us with a pandemic in 2004 onwards. And it's significant that, in fact, we put aside some $6 billion, that's $1 billion, to address this issue. And that, I would say, was justifiable. Because if we look at history, and we should look at history, and we'll come to that a little later, we can see that influenza has had, in the period following the First World War, immediate and enormous impact, in fact, on the human population. And we saw at that time between 50 and 100 million people die. So that gives you a measure of why we were concerned, and that is, in large part, the reason why One Health has been invigorated and the name One Health has been established. But why did that come about? Anyone know who this man is? Any office? Well, he was the Surgeon General. And in 1967, he said it was time to close the book on infectious diseases. The war against infectious diseases has been won, and it's time to pay more attention to chronic ailments such as cancer and heart disease. And that had a chilling effect on public health throughout the United States, arguably throughout the world. And in some ways, perhaps you could see why that justification was put forward at the time. Because we were on the path to the eradication, the global eradication of smallpox. And this is a horrible disease. It shaped history in so many different ways. And just look at these statistics. Annually, before the introduction of vaccination, through the work of Edward Jenner, and we'll come back to Jenner later as well, we saw approximately 400,000 Europeans dying of smallpox each year. And in the 20th century alone, worldwide, we saw perhaps 300 to 400 million people dying of smallpox. So that was an enormous achievement, and we were perhaps buoyed by that feeling that we had infectious diseases under control. But look what happened. Since 1981, we've had a whole series of different diseases. By the way, my background is as a veterinarian and as a virologist, so therefore you're going to see a preponderance of viral disease. But the reality of it is, there are smiles down here because they're virologists as well, okay? Viruses are important, but I always point out too that other things are important as well as we go through. And I'm not going to go through and name each of these, but you can see that the impact of infectious disease since 1981 has been significant. And of course, at the moment, we are concerned about Ebola. We recognize that we dropped the ball on Ebola. The World Health Organization has come under significant criticism for that. And while the statistics at the moment, particularly in Liberia, are very, very encouraging, last week's statistics for Guinea would indicate that, in fact, there's a resurgence of cases. So now is not the time to relax. So, what are some of the questions, therefore, we should ask of each other at this point? And I think it's appropriate to point out the book, and I'm sure many of you read it, The Tipping Point. So, what went wrong from the days when we pronounced that diseases were common? Why have they impacted our lives so significantly? And more importantly, for you as ecologists, and I'm assuming today that most of you, and indeed most of us are, even though we're veterinarians or physicians, we are all ecologists. have we as a global society really lost appreciation of the balance of nature? And I think we have come so far in many cases from our roots within nature that we have become divorced from the reality of nature. I'm talking about society in general. And if we are alarmist, or perhaps realistic, I don't know which is the correct balance here, are these diseases simply a symptom of now a sick planet? So, are we at a tipping point? And of course, the corollary is, what can we do about this? And are we doing enough? So the thesis of my presentation is essentially looking forward 100 years. You may argue not 100 years, let's just go to 2050 when we get population, global population balance. But at least certainly a perspective into the future. We're entering a very uncertain future. We all recognize the political insecurity at the moment, instability, the food insecurity that we have to address before we get to 2050. And then, of course, for my particular area of interest, where is pandemic disease? And it is within this context that One Health provides a vehicle for multidisciplinary action. This is Sarah's definition coming through here, in controlling and preventing disease and establishing food or mitigating food insecurity through the promotion of healthy ecosystems. Note that the phraseology is healthy ecosystems, while acknowledging the complexity and the needs of today's global society. So that's One Health as a definition. Now, different people have different definitions, but that is essentially the central theme. A quick perspective on my own career so that you can see where I come from, so that you can see my bias and you can interpret it appropriately. My major interests over the course of time have been in identifying life cycles and identifying then spillover events when a disease comes from one species into another species or something triggers an epidemic. And then trying to put that into policy and prevention through development of vaccines. And more recently, I've had the privilege, as one grows older, one starts to think a little bit more about where one comes from and where society is going. And starting to look at where the horizon is, and obviously preparing young people to do the work of the next 50 years or so. Remember that all of you who are in your 20s in the audience at the moment are probably going to be in your profession working for at least the next 50 years. So what I'm talking about is going to be impacting you. And I think it will be a significant impact, and your contributions are going to be valuable. So, a quick word about definitions, drivers of disease emergence, applying One Health, and then working through conclusion, and always reflecting also on history and the wide variety of species that we all deal with, and their interaction. So, we've already defined One Health a few times over, okay? I'm not going to go into it, but here is eco-health. And I think we're now seeing convergence of the phraseology or the terminology of eco-health and One Health. And in 2 years' time, I've just been at the third One Health Congress in Amsterdam, and the proposal is that the fourth will actually be a joint meeting with eco-health. So the two are coming together. And in many cases, eco-health can be considered to be synonymous now with One Health. Let's talk a little bit about disease emergence. I think all of you are pretty aware of these drivers. This is nothing new to you. Accelerated global trading, tourism patterns of the late 20th century and the current century, and we're seeing pathogens then as hitchhikers. Speed of transportation. You can get around the world now in a shorter time than incubation period. And for us in this audience today, the exposure to new pathogens through ecosystem disruptions. And that's through human population pressures, exposure to wildlife, and also then climate change. And then on the more strictly veterinary side of it, we see intensification and monoculture farming, and that allows amplification of disease, such as you will see in big poultry establishments or even big cattle operations. And in many cases, these are acting in concert, or at least in ways that we don't fully understand, to then produce on occasion the perfect storm. So that's where horizon scanning comes in. How can we, in fact, offset that? And let's just look at these two, or this graph here. It's one that Fred Murphy, a colleague of mine, put together a number of years ago. And it relates to the time here to circumnavigate the globe, which is now 24 hours. Now, if you are in Chicago in the middle of winter and you want to get back to Texas A&M, you may not believe that you can get around the world in 24 hours. But that is essentially what the picture is. And you then sort of equate that or put that against the rise in human population. And that graph, probably more than any other, explains a lot of the emerging diseases that we see today. And look at some of these statistics. Annually, the world's airlines carrying a staggering total approaching some 2 billion passengers. And as we are speaking at the moment, there are 500,000 people up physically in the air. And if you begin to see the potential then of any of those individuals bringing disease, either because they're infected themselves or because they're simply acting as vehicles and carrying a virus or whatever it might be in food or things of that nature. So looking at tourist patterns for the next year, for the next 25 years, is a way also of determining which way diseases may be moving. And if you look at the Airbus data and the Boeing data and where those future markets are, you can get some idea of potential areas where disease is going to emerge from. And obviously China is one that historically has been a very rich country in terms of the emergence of disease, and also problems historically, but not now, in terms of allowing information to escape from China. But we also have to look at it in terms of world population. And the good news is that when we get out to about 2050, it's anticipated that we will be in balance. But 2050 is quite a long way away. And this was a statistic that came out of USDA, which I don't know where it comes from, but it's a fantastic quote. That over the next 50 years, we will need to produce as much food for the world's population as has been produced in the entire history of mankind. Who calculated that? I don't know. But let's assume that it is true. But not only do we have a hunger issue, but we also find that this clearly is the petri dish then for epidemics, because we have this larger and more crowded population. In terms of ecological disruption, this information is from Billy Koresh from the Wildlife Conservation Society at that time. He's now with Eco Health Alliance. And I think it's a very poignant statistic in terms of the amount of damage to conservation that is happening through the harvesting of bushmeat. And this one I find particularly upsetting, is probably the best way, the arm of a gorilla being handled by an individual here. And bushmeat, the harvesting of bushmeat, obviously in terms of disease, has implications, and we are seeing that at the moment with Ebola. Where did Ebola come from? We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Peter Daszak, before we really coined the word One Health, had this publication in Science, which I think puts wildlife at the top of the Venn diagram appropriately. And then all these various factors, these various drivers that fit into that. And of course, what that also then represents is the way in which One Health has to coordinate our approach to disease control. So, let me give you at least a few personal examples where I have at least been following up on different drivers in different ways. And let's talk a little bit about Ebola. I worked at one point on rinderpest and other diseases in West Africa. Not so much these countries, but in Nigeria and Ghana. So I at least know what the biology of the area is like. And I can recognize how difficult it must have been to have, or is, to be controlling an epidemic of Ebola in this region. And the statistics, sadly, are indicating that at the moment, we've seen mortality to the tune of over 10,000 people. But the impact, economic impact also, beyond the human misery and grief, is also significant. So we have to remember that as well as we move forward. And we've been looking for a number of years, really, for the reservoir of Ebola. You can't see the data here, unfortunately, from the screen grab, but it starts off in 1976 in what was then Zaire. And since that time, we have been tracking what might be the reservoir. And at one point, we thought that perhaps primates were involved. But now the evidence is beginning to indicate that probably bats are, in fact, the reservoir. And in 2008, there was a Dutch tourist who died of the related virus of Marburg, having visited the Python Cave in Uganda. And perhaps some of you here in the audience have been here. And I happened to be in Uganda at the time, and if I have an opportunity to look at where a disease emerges, then I usually take that. So I had a veterinary surgeon at the time with whom I had been working on master's degrees, and he had also been involved in the control of Bugia, Ebola virus in Uganda that year. So together we went off to the Queen Elizabeth Park, and at that point we discovered that this tourist had died. So the following day we went to, in fact, the Python Cave, because it was being linked to the possible exposure of this this tourist. And to cut long story short, CDC was already there, and from their work, it's now being recognized that the Egyptian fruit bat is probably the reservoir of Marburg, and the extension then of the argument is that Ebola is also emerging from bats as well. But to my knowledge, and someone may be able to correct me here, I don't think that the true reservoir of Ebola has yet been recognized. So a lot of it is circumstantial in terms of the outbreak at the moment in West Africa. So CDC feels sufficiently confident at the moment that it is recognizing then the endemic cycle and the epidemic cycle. And of course, this diagram here, this map of Africa, indicates that the distribution of Ebola is now much wider than we had hitherto suspected. And also that was a factor, if you look at the history whereby the 2-year-old who died of Ebola, it was recognized that he was infected probably at the end of 2013, but the World Health Organization didn't, in fact, declare that Ebola was present in West Africa until the end of March. So, significantly, we don't have good early detection systems at the moment. One of the areas that I have also had an interest in is influenza, and this would probably be a title for a good movie, I would have thought, Lessons in Promiscuity and Plasticity. And what I mean by that is simply that influenza viruses have this great ability to jump from one species to another, the spillover effect. And obviously the plasticity reflects the fact that influenza viruses can share, because it's a segmented genome, they can very easily share their genes. And we were involved a few years ago in 2004, which was exactly the time when H5N1 was emerging, and we recognized that equine influenza had jumped across into dogs, and we had a major epidemic then of influenza in dogs in the United States. So these viruses are exceedingly interesting. They originate across time from essentially dabbling ducks, and that is the natural reservoir. And I don't know whether Dr. Hussein is going to talk about that, but he's an expert in this, so he can answer all the questions when it comes to plasticity and promiscuity. How about that? Okay? And I'm not going to go into hemoglobin and everything else at this time. But what this represents is that we are, over the course of time, I've already mentioned this enormous epidemic that followed the First World War. And by the way, it was called the Spanish influenza, but it originated in the United States in all probability. It was called that because during the First World War, Spain was neutral, and the information on what was happening in Europe came out of Spain, and it became known as the Spanish influenza. But prior to that, going back in terms of pre-virology history, we suspect that some of the H3s might even have been causing major human epidemics and associated, at least here in North America, with horses. And that brings us back to the dogs and the horses, etc., etc. So the message here is One Health, hopefully, provides us with a method of thinking a little bit outside the box what might also happen. And of course, what has happened in our recent concern is that we've also had now an H7N9 that's causing concern and causing disease in people. We also had then the pandemic of H1N1, which fortunately was not particularly virulent. But it was that $6 billion that was spent that then set us up to be prepared for other influenza viruses. And if we look at the way in which H5N1 jumped across to Europe and then down into Africa, we see that most of what happened in Asia was associated with trade, particularly trade involving domestic poultry. But then when it came to its movement into Europe, this was associated with the movement of wild birds. And with one exception from South Africa many years ago, wild birds hitherto had not been associated with the transmission over distance of the highly pathogenic form of avian influenza. So our knowledge of bird migration comes into this, or our lack of knowledge, and of course today bird migration patterns relative to climate change point out the importance again of One Health. And in 2005 I had the opportunity to get up into northern Vietnam, and it was then that I began to appreciate the socio-ecology of disease, the dependence of people on the domestic ducks, the interaction between the domestic ducks and the wild ducks, how the domestic ducks then feed into the poultry, and how the chickens, and how the chickens then get fed into the local markets, the live markets, and things of that nature. So a knowledge of the ecology of the area and the economics of the area is critically important. So FAO puts together essentially this Venn diagram, which gives you a good idea then of all the different factors that have to be considered within a One Health rubric to address pandemic risk. So let's now dissect out this little one. This is climate change. This is an area that we in the US, historically, we've been slow to respond to a lot of this. European governments, particularly the British government, has essentially directed Cabinet that it should think, whenever it comes to a major decision within the context of climate change, such as the significance of climate change. In Florida, the two of us here from Florida, we are ashamed. I am ashamed. Maureen, you are ashamed. That our governor has subtly, not so subtly, indicated that the words climate change and global warming will not be mentioned by any state employee, at least in government. And I find that unbelievable. So, we focused on the Arctic, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the areas up towards the Arctic. I usually give this as a teaser to my students to point out that art is getting wrong sometimes. But the important thing is that I think that most people perceive that this is a problem of polar bears. And by focusing on the Arctic, we've missed so many other opportunities for education. But that's another issue. So, clearly, the Arctic is becoming politically, you'll excuse the pun, a hot potato in terms of global change. We're already seeing, in terms of the politics of the area, we're now beginning to see everyone trying to make sure that they have a piece of the Arctic. They're moving forces up into that area. So that is a new theater of political tension. For those of us here in this audience who are below 30 certainly, then you can be expecting to see a temperature rise of 2 degrees centigrade. In some areas much more than that. And arguably it's going to be one of the most important factors affecting the quality of our lives as we go forward. But I also recognize that when we're at least looking at the ecology of disease, the climate change is only one of them, and it's very difficult to tease it out. So a few years ago I was asked to give a similar presentation to today on climate change and to look at where agriculture and veterinary diseases, if I can use that phrase, how they would be impacted by climate change. And when you start looking at the arboviruses like Eastern equine encephalitis, you can argue now that because it's transmitted, the basic endemic cycle is involving Aculeata melanura, which is a temperate breeding species, that in Florida we will see the line move up from Okeechobee, say, to Gainesville, but we're also now seeing that disease is occurring in Maine, where hitherto it wasn't seen before. But it's much more difficult to dissect that out, nevertheless, because the virus is present quite often in an endemic situation, and we don't always appreciate where those areas are. So I thought it would be a good idea to go up to Alaska and see what Alaska had to offer in terms of climate change. And it was at the time when Sarah Palin was running as vice president. I went to her office, but unfortunately she had already left. This was in June. But it was also an opportunity to see how the Alaskans were looking at climate change at the time. And in that context, there's no question that there are effects present in Alaska at the moment. And we go back then to the writings of John Muir, who canoed through the Glacier Bay. We know where the glaciers were at that point. We can also see other issues, particularly spruce bark beetles, and this is outside my area of expertise, which apparently is also resulted from stress from reduced snowpack. But I was looking for scientific proof, if I could find something, and I was very pleased to at least find 2 examples. And this one, many of you may know about this, relates then to a disease of Chinook salmon. It's a fungal disease, I barely can say that, so I'm not even going to try. But essentially what it has been found is that the salmon are now swimming in a Yukon River that is 3 degrees centigrade warmer than it was hitherto, and therefore this increases the rate at which the fungus grows, and instead of spawning in the upper tributaries, they're now dying on their route up to the spawning area. And all this is documented. But most importantly, what the USGS scientists have done is that they have used then trout as a model system, put them into swim tanks to measure stamina, and they found that the trout that are infected with fungus have very much reduced stamina. So that was one nice example. And the other one related then to a virus very close to my heart, because it's in the same family as winterpest and canine distemper, and also measles virus, which of course is rather topical at the moment. And this relates to the fact that the sea ice since 1988 has progressively reduced under climate change, and now that has opened up a route from the Atlantic into the Pacific, and they are now finding that sea otters are being infected by this seal virus that is now in the Pacific. And then the molecular scientists have looked at both viruses from the Pacific and the Atlantic and find there is only one single nucleotide change. So essentially, they are the same virus. So I think that's another example here of intercontinental or interoceanic spread of a pathogen. So now let's sort of step back and say, well, what can we learn from history? And of course, this statement that we sometimes learn very little from history, or man learns little from history, in other words, doesn't appreciate it, I think is very true. So for the young members of the audience, I would encourage you to read back into history. And then I will talk a little bit about progress. And if you don't 1967, when we did not use vaccination, despite the fact we had vaccines. And I also had, for my PhD, I was looking rather esoterically, you may say, I was looking at cows' teats. And the reason I was doing that, because they have various virus diseases, and that leads to cattle getting mastitis. So that was a good veterinary project to begin my career. And I discovered what turned out to be the very last outbreak of cowpox in the United Kingdom, which was about 20 miles away from where Jenner did all his work on the development of the vaccine. And that has influenced my career ever since. And I'm a firm believer in vaccines. And I would argue that this is the most significant document in the history of medicine. This document leads through to the development of vaccination, which is the most powerful tool that we have in the armory that we have available to us as One Health practitioners. But we also need to recognize that Jenner was a naturalist, and he actually worked out the life cycle of the cuckoo and the way in which the cuckoo ejects the nestlings or the eggs. And therefore, my point here is that we need to look at the way in which scientists were integrated across veterinary medicine, ecology, and the observed time. There are a lot of slides here that I put together because I found it fascinating, going back to Gilbert White and so on. And then also through the United States. And this is one that you might like to think about. This is Emerson. And I think this is rather an appropriate quote here, that nature gives, but humans fail to reciprocate. And that may be, in fact, where we are today. We have this detachment from nature. I'm now talking about society, not people sitting here today. And then that leads us through to the whistleblowers. And I think the whistleblowers are very important. I think we may be hearing about Silent Spring later on. I don't have a high opinion of many politicians, as you already know. But this was another whistleblower. And I certainly don't support the royal family particularly, despite my British origins. But at least on this one, the Prince of Wales is bringing together this principle of harmony, which I think is important. And the whole sensitivity of how we are on a very limited planet and how we need to take care of it. Okay, to that. And this probably was the seminal document that really led through to the drive for One Health. And this was the report of 1992, which really focused in large part on the emergence of HIV at the time, but it pointed out that there are other diseases that we should be aware of. And this was obviously from the Institute of Medicine. So, let's have a look at what we've done in 10 years, and let me have a look at the clock at the moment. We're probably, what, about another 10 minutes or so? Okay, good. So let's speed up a little bit. Okay, so where is One Health gone? Where are we today? I had the privilege of putting together this lead article in the Veterinary Record at the beginning of last year. And this is a diagram that now comes out of One Health Sweden. And it probably indicates to us now the breadth of One Health. And there's that quote from Lewis Carroll, I think Alice and Humpty Dumpty, and Humpty Dumpty basically said, I will use a word to mean whatever I want it to. And in some ways there's a danger that One Health has fallen into this trap. Different people have different definitions of One Health. And we need to be aware of that. But my initial reaction, because One Health has come out of disease, a disease focus, is that it should be restricted to looking at disease. But then I began to realize that the spirit of working together, in fact, is far more important than anyone keeping disease to their own particular interests. And not that it is being particularly clear here, but you now see that there's a whole range of different activities within health that constitute One Health. And remember, the World Health Organization definition of health is that it's not only physical health, but it is also mental health and well-being. And that's important to remember. And that is the definition, therefore, that is broad in One Health. There's a great achievement. In 2011, we celebrated the eradication of rinderpest. And this is almost the equivalent of smallpox. Rinderpest killed 90% of cattle. And this particular quote, I think, is one that almost encapsulates what rinderpest has done over the course of time. The Maasai, as you know, are very dependent on cattle. And when the disease got into Africa, through what was then Abyssinia by the Italian army accidentally importing it, although some would say that they imported it for bioterrorism in today's definition of biowarfare. You can see the number of the Maasai that died. And that's a tragic statement. Relative to Ebola, we need to remember that each year, between 30, the latest figures that came out from, well, I was talking to people from WHO last week, it's probably now between 30 and 35,000, so that's good. But we're still getting enormous numbers of people dying of rabies. And rabies is as horrible a death, obviously, as Ebola is. And there is now a target to eliminate canine rabies, and obviously these cases are occurring, particularly in India, through, in fact, the wild dogs, the unowned dogs that are now present in India. And by the way, the disaster of diclofenac and how it's killed off the vultures has meant that the dog population has increased, and therefore the risk of rabies in the human population is also increasing. And there's mission rabies now to eradicate canine rabies globally. Right? I want to emphasize this is canine rabies, which obviously we have effectively done here in the US, but the whole world, hopefully, will be free of canine rabies by 2030. And then we're seeing One Health being picked up by National Park Service, that its operations are framed within One Health. We're seeing Healthy Oceans are adopting this as well. And we're seeing it right down to the operating theatres, where the use of this particular dog is just one small example, and it can more effectively detect when this little girl is essentially having histamine release more than the anesthesiologist can pick it up, or quicker. And the dog actually went into the operating theatre with this little girl. And we're then seeing the bigger picture, antibiotic resistance being framed within One Health. Welfare is coming under One Health. And then we're seeing the colleges around the world, such as universities such as here in Texas A&M, are also changing their curriculum. There's a new vet school in Lincoln Memorial University in Tennessee that is framing its entire preclinical curriculum actually under the direction of One Health. And what we're doing in Florida, as I said, is being paralleled elsewhere. And these are just some of the practitioners of One Health. They're all personally known to me. This one may be of more topical interest. This was taken last week over in Amsterdam at the 3rd One Health Congress. Kendra Stauffer, a veterinarian, graduated a number of years ago, works for CDC, and she had been then stationed in West Africa to be contact tracing cases of Ebola. And this was the first time that, well, the first meeting she'd been to after being released from quarantine. And she was telling me that CDC rules are that no one comes within 6 feet of you when you're doing any contact tracing. And the only way that you greet your colleagues, your professional colleagues, is with an elbow bump. So therefore, for us to have a hug was something that was quite unusual for them. And all these other students are coming out and working in the area. Charles Noki was the individual with whom I went to look at the python cave, and he has worked in Ebola outbreaks as well. So what are the future challenges? Well, we have to remember that if we look at it within the framework of the millennial goals, and of course, the United Nations and the World Health Organization is now restructuring where we go for the next 15 years, we can see that we've made major achievements, but we are still finding that we have a large proportion still of people who are undernourished and going hungry. And if we look at sanitation practices, and these sort of data were coming out when we were meeting last November in Geneva, looking at neglected zoonoses, the parasitic diseases particularly. And at the moment, there's still about 1 billion people who are practicing open defecation. So we need to recognize the bigger picture under which we are operating. And as One Health has got bigger and bigger, the big challenge that we have is, in fact, recognizing how to construct the teams, but also then how to keep the teams together. So focus becomes important. And then we've got all these marvelous tools at our fingertips, but do we know how to use them? And for example, these data from 2014, and we can see now that the world population is about 7.2 billion, and yet there are now 6.9 billion cell phone subscriptions each year. Now, that doesn't mean to say everyone always has every cell phone, because Maureen, for example, Gibbs, speaking next, has got 2 or 3 cell phones. All right? And that happens across the board. But how do we use them? Larry Brilliant, when he was with Google, he had a great email address. It was brilliant at Google. .org. And he's now with the Skull Foundation, but he actually was involved in the eradication of smallpox. And his drive is to get early detection. And you know there are algorithms now that Google has so that you can pick up when people are going to pharmacies to pick up Pepto-Bismol, indicates you've probably got an outbreak of Giardia or something in the area. But then how people are using Google when they are concerned that they've perhaps got influenza. So you can pick up activity that way. And the earlier that you can detect something, then clearly the better you can get your response moving. And that would very much apply to Ebola. But for you in this room, you're all always looking at how to maintain funding streams. Jonah Mazet and her colleagues, and obviously Dr. Hussaini can come in here because he's involved in all of this. This is an enormous achievement that USA has continued to support, predict, prevent, identify, and respond with significant funding. But it only comes with significant and hard work. And finally, we have to look at how we modify behavior. And we had this meeting in WHO. It was a 3-day meeting. It was the 4th meeting on neglected zoonoses, and they are a subset of the neglected tropical diseases. And we're just not getting the message across in many cases as to how we can break the transmission cycle. So I think modifying behavior becomes critically important. And that's why I put socio-ecology into the title of my talk. Because we need to be working more closely with the sociologists, the anthropologists, the geographers, right, to achieve the break in the transmission cycle. I'm looking at it once again from my own perspective, which is disease. I also guess that men don't read as well as ladies, on the basis that you have to emphasize it 3 times. We have to remember that we're all stewards and stakeholders of the planet, so we all need to take responsibility, and we need to make sure that others are aware of their responsibility. And relative to modifying behavior, look at the problem. 20% of adults in the United States are still smoking, even though they know all the facts. And we have got a much better appreciation of climate change in the general public than ever we do of One Health. So we're failing to get that. Excuse me. That's 45 minutes. I thought cricket was rather good for us. Okay, start again. See, challenged by technology. Right. Thank you. Okay. And I've gone backwards as well at the same time. Right, so we don't have the general public recognizing important. So we need to get the media people. How do you communicate? How do you communicate at different levels? We're not talking about just communication with the policymakers. We're talking about we're talking about communication right across the whole spectrum. If a man will not use a latrine in certain areas of the world because a woman who is menstruating is also possibly using that latrine, then how do we get over these problems? I mean, that's the level of it when it comes to breaking parasitic life cycles and things of that nature. And that really leads me through to pointing out the importance of cultural sensitivity in all that we do. So what are the conclusions? Maybe you disagree with what I'm saying here, that we are entering into a very uncertain future. Perhaps you feel it's more stable than I'm painting it. What we're trying to do is essentially look after the planet. Now that sounds a very grandiose statement. But if climate change is having such an effect on the climate, it is having such an effect on the world, perhaps in a way that we are not detecting it, but that it is leading through to a tipping point, for example, then shouldn't we be concerned? Shouldn't we be looking at the pressure of population? I haven't put Malthus into any of this. Some of the slides here were on Malthus. It takes too long to describe the gloomy clergyman. But essentially, are we outstripping our resources? 2050 is when we hope we're going to be stabilizing in terms of world population. But it will still be 9 billion mouths to feed, with an expectation that they will want more protein, that they will want to improve their standard of living. So we need to be addressing the practicality of One Health. We need to go from the rhetoric, because up to now, One Health, in its new form, has been focused on rhetoric. We need to translate the rhetoric into reality. We're getting moving, and I think PREDICT is just one example of in fact, how we're seeing the spectrum, that we're getting policy from central government, from federal government in this case, and we're seeing it being injected into those programs that may be effective into the long term. So how do you want to define One Health? You can define it as you want, provided that it is essentially looking at interdisciplinary approaches that are going to promote human, animal, and environmental health through that interdisciplinary action. So you need to get your colleagues worried, but they need to be interactive with others. So if we're going to look at the bigger picture, I would argue that we need to re-engage with nature. That as a society, we have failed to appreciate how important nature is to us. We've had an arrogance that, as I said, was pointed out by the whistleblowers. So we need to be identifying and listening to the whistleblowers. My own view, of course, is that the Earth will survive, but it may not survive with us necessarily as the top species. That's not going to be a change that's going to occur within my lifetime, not within your lifetime, and not perhaps for the next 1,000 years. And I have confidence that, honestly, the ingenuity of man means that certainly we will survive as a species. But ultimately, because I couldn't give a lecture to you folks without quoting Darwin, that it's not the strongest of the species who survive nor the most intelligent, but it's the most responsive to change. Thank you very much.